Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special beverage panel for St. Patrick's Day, which will be starting very soon if you're in the United States and is already underway if you're in Ireland. Um, we're very excited for these panels because this gives us a chance to talk with industry experts and really dive into the nitty gritty of what makes whiskey so amazing. And today we have a one-on-one panel situation, and so we have one guest today who is, for me, kind of historically significant because he was my first big interview in the industry for UPROXX when I was getting started way back in 2017. And he's also, in my opinion, one of the greatest legends in Irish whiskey who's working today, which I hope he doesn't get too blushed about being called a legend, even though I believe it's true. He is Brian Nation, who has worked as the distiller in Middleton and is now working in the United States and Minnesota at O'SHAUGHNESSY Distilling. And he's here to talk with us about Irish American whiskey culture and making whiskey in Ireland and America. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Zach. Absolutely my pleasure to be here. It's great to chat to you again. I can't believe that interview was 5 years ago.
I know, right?
But,
time flies.
It flies when you're having fun, yeah?
Absolutely, absolutely. And, again, thank you for joining us today. And I think for our audience, if you guys have any questions, there's a Q&A section, and we'll get to the questions as you answer them, because I think this will be a little more free-flowing than the usual panels we have, where the Q&A is usually for the end. But Brian, I have the first question. Let's talk a little bit about how you got into whiskey in the beginning. Did you come from a sort of science background? Did you come from more of you just got a job at a distillery and worked your way up background? As a combination of both?
Well, to be honest with you, it was actually by total accident. I ended up working in a distillery, but as I described it was the best accident that ever happened to me. My background was chemical and process engineering. So I did that college degree for 4 years. And as I was coming to the end of the degree, like everybody else that would have been in the same class as me, the expectation would have been you'd end up in a pharmaceutical plant or oil refining, because that was the kind of businesses that was typically around chemical engineering at the time. I worked in both. I worked in the oil refinery first, and then I moved to a pharmaceutical plant. I spent short periods of time there. I couldn't say I really enjoyed them. I felt I was very restricted in what I was doing. And that was possibly because, being a graduate engineer, you think you're probably going to take on the world straight away. And that never does happen, because you do have to go through a learning process. But while I was kind of not happy in these places, an opportunity arose at the distillery in Middleton for me to become an environmental engineer. So I went and worked as a year in the Middleton distillery for a year as environmental engineer. Then I moved into projects and kind of getting to understand how to debottleneck the plant, worked with a team there to try and debottleneck the plant and increase capacity. And then over time, I moved into production. And that's when I worked for 12 years before under Barry Crockett, and then ultimately took over as Master Distiller in 2013. So really had a great exposure to the whole process. And it was over that time my appreciation of whiskey making actually developed as well, and appreciation of whiskey in general. And, really had a fantastic grounding from start to finish in the whole process, and really thankful and grateful for everything I learned at Middleton.
And it's a fascinating era to have been a master distiller in whiskey in general, because that, early 2010s to, now basically, was a massive, massive whiskey boom, especially in Ireland. Can you sort of talk us through like what you saw change in Ireland over that time from, we were there together when Bow Street reopened, for instance, which was something that I think people were, if you ask people 30 years ago if that would happen, they probably told you were crazy. But also the craft whiskey boom, arrived in Ireland around the same time as it did in the US. Can you walk us through like the changes you saw in the industry then, and how that sort of affected you carrying on to where you are now?
Well, I suppose, first of all, to see, you know, it was a great time to be involved in the whiskey industry simply because the Irish whiskey category was one of the fastest growing spirit categories around the world for years. And to see that renaissance in Irish whiskey, that was really, really exciting. And that in itself caused the development of new distilleries into Ireland, which was great to see because, you know, we up to maybe 10, 12 years ago, there was really only 3 distilleries. There was Irish Distillers in Middleton, there was Cooley Distillery, and there was Bushmills. And then you start seeing Dingle Distillery would have probably been the first distillery to come on board. And now you see such a huge amount of distilleries in Ireland, and all of them creating, you know, their own different unique style of distillate. They're all producing, they all have different story, different background, and they're creating, the most important thing is that they're creating quality Irish whiskey, because that's key. In order for a category to sustain and to grow, you need to ensure that the quality of the whiskey that these distilleries are producing is good. And you can see what's coming out of these distilleries at the moment is great quality. So what that's doing is it's creating even a renewed interest again in Irish whiskey, because there's such a broad landscape of different distilleries in different locations using different techniques, different styles, maybe some different mash bills, obviously having to adhere to the Irish whiskey file, which gives you designated ways on what you can do to produce a pot still whiskey or a single malt or a grain whiskey. But there's lots of exciting innovation going on, and that in itself has been, you know, has really excited me in the roles that I've been in Middleton, and obviously since I moved across to O'Shaughnessy Distilling, I'm working on Keeper's Heart brand. That innovation, that thirst for innovation and new product development is something that really drives me every day.
So let's, before we jump over to the new project, let's talk a little bit about the connective tissue between American whiskey and Irish whiskey, because there's one very, very big connective bridge, which is the barrels. Irish whiskey is often aged in ex-bourbon barrels and, of course, ex-sherry barrels, or a combination thereof. Can you talk us through a little bit how, you know, like Irish grain whiskey, which has maize in it or corn, that sort of feel that you get from a bourbon barrel and how that affects Irish whiskey today?
Yeah, well, when you think about it, right? I mean, in America, typically to produce a bourbon or a rye, you have to use virgin American barrels. So once that maturation process is ended, they go back to cooperages, and typically Irish distilleries and Scottish distillery buy these barrels to mature their whiskies in them afterwards. So, you know, you have a very, very high percentage of Irish whiskey would be matured in refill American barrels. Then you do have the addition of fortified wine barrels, be them sherry, be them port, be them, you know, other types of dessert wine or sweet wine barrels. But the majority of them would be using refill American barrels to mature their whiskies in. So that kind of relationship is essential for the process at the moment, in terms of, you know, the American whiskey industry and the coopering industry needs to get rid of these barrels, and the Irish and Scotch whiskey industries want to use these barrels. And when you talk about something like a grain whiskey, where Irish grain whiskey is typically made from corn or wheat, but a very high percentage, you know, you could be talking upwards of 90 to 95% corn, and the rest being malted barley, are typically the same in wheat. And that produces quite a light style of whiskey, typically, because it comes off a continuous column. So if you're doing it triple distilled, you could come off that column at typically 188 proof. And you know yourself, the closer you go to neutral alcohol, the less flavor, the less congeners are left in the distillate. But what does tend to happen is, and particularly like even the grain whiskey that we use for Keeper's Heart, the distillation process captures a nice butterscotch caramel note, typically diacetyl would be one of the congeners that would be in that distillate. That when it's mature then in refill American barrels, what you tend to get is you get less of that oak contribution, but you get more of that vanilla sweetness, which enhances the butterscotch caramel note. So that kind of connective tissue really does work well, and works well particularly with Irish whiskey.
Right, because then you're adding the sort of the vanilla and the spice from the bourbon barrel that brings that classic sort of sweet, spicy layer underneath of the whiskey.
Exactly. And then obviously with the quintessential Irish style of whiskey, which uses malted barley and unmalted barley, which in itself creates, a nice spicy characteristic and sometimes some herbal earthy notes coupled with some nice fruits. The maturation in those refill American barrels as well actually brings a nice enhancement of that vanilla sweetness into it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've always been a big fan of Irish whiskey just for that. The sort of the bridge between the fruity and the sweet, and then the kind of bourbony vanilla and caramel butterscotch, and the earthiness is what I've been getting into recently, especially in the single pot stills.
Yeah.
You can get a really nice bark note and a nice sort of soily note in there, and it's a wonderful thing. So shifting over, then of course, it's clear to see America's influence on Irish whiskey just in barreling alone, but also, of course, corn or maize coming in, being an American grain, having that influence on grain whiskeys, single grain whiskeys, and then grain whiskeys that are blended into Irish blended whiskeys. Let's flip that over to the other side and look how, Irish whiskey then influenced American whiskey in the sense that, a huge amount of Irish whiskey went over to the United States historically. When Prohibition came along, it was devastating to the Irish whiskey industry. Almost destroyed it, basically. Then, of course, the British blockade of tariffs helped to further destroy Irish whiskey throughout the 20th century. Thankfully, the rebound happened in the early 21st century. But you have a special sort of view of this, given that you're now working in the United States, making what is essentially Irish American whiskey. Can you walk us through the process that enticed you to, cross the pond, so to speak, to make whiskey in America as opposed to continue making whiskey in Ireland?
Yeah, well, before we get on to that, I suppose it's important to recognize that, Irish whiskey was the biggest selling whiskey worldwide pre-Prohibition. Right. It exported more, greater volumes of whiskey than any other whiskey category in the world at that time. And, it was a number of unfortunate events, including Prohibition, that really kind of led to the demise. So seeing Irish whiskey actually going through a renaissance now is actually no surprise, considering where it was a number of years ago. So that's an exciting time to be involved in whiskey again, as you said earlier. In terms of what enticed me to move across to the US and take on this journey and adventure, if I keep on saying this, as somebody said it to me 3 or 4 years ago, that I would leave my fantastic role in Irish Distillers and move across to the US with my family and move to Minneapolis, I would have told them they were mad. It would never happen. Right. But what actually happened was there was a chap called Patrick O'Shaughnessy who reached out to me via LinkedIn, asking me would I be interested to have a conversation with him about a new whiskey adventure that he was planning on going on. I don't know what I honestly to this day don't understand why I reached back to the man, because I would have had a lot of these, calls over the time through LinkedIn to say, and you just kind of ignore them. But something caused me to respond to Patrick. And when I responded to Patrick, he asked that we have a phone call, and we had a phone call. And, it was one of those moments where you actually come on the call, you're expecting not much to come of the conversation, but there's an instant connection in terms of his passion really, really excited me. Also his idea and the thought process that had gone through, that they had gone through in order to come to this stage. This wasn't just a fly-by-night idea where basically they just said, oh, we'll just reach out to somebody and see if this has worked. They had looked at the Irish whiskey category. They had looked at, trends over the years. And Patrick's idea of, bringing Irish and American whiskey traditions together to produce a whiskey that showcased the best of both worlds did excite me. But at the same time, it was still a kind of, look, Patrick, I'm very happy where I am. I've no intention of moving my family over to the US. And the conversation ended with Patrick saying, you know, if I'm in Ireland in the next 3 months, would you meet me? I said, yeah. I said, I'll meet you as long as it doesn't conflict in anything that I'm doing with Irish distillers. I said, if there's anything I can do to help you, I'll help you. But I said, that's as far as it will go. Came off the call, and about 20 minutes later, a text came through. I'm flying into Ireland in 3 days, and I'm actually with my cousin and my uncle, and we'll meet you anywhere. So we met them in Cork, and they asked me to bring my wife along as well, who came along as, I won't say a willing participant. It was probably more like an unwilling participant, because her reaction was, you're never going to leave Irish Distillers. You've been there 20 whatever years. You're married to the job. You know, you're never going to leave. So what are you doing this for? And I was kind of going, well, look, he was a nice guy. We connected. Let's see what comes of this conversation. And it's better for you to be there to hear it firsthand rather than me hearing it and then coming back and telling you. So we arrived with zero expectations. We really considered that this was going to be an hour and a half of a nice conversation, have a chat, maybe offer a little bit of advice, and that would be it. The conversation actually ended up talking. We ended up having a meal for over 5 hours.
Right.
With no talk of whiskey. It was talking about life in general. It was talking about family. It was talking about what was important to us, what we wanted for our family. And it was just a fantastic connection with the three, with Michael, Patrick, and Jerry O'Shaughnessy. They were great people. They were very friendly, and it was an instant connection. So I always tell people the first reason that I made the decision was because of the people. But then obviously the second opportunity, the second and third reasons were the opportunity to be involved with building a brand from the ground up and building a distillery from the ground up was something that not many people get the opportunity to do. And I suppose I was at a stage in my career where this opportunity came along. If I made the decision to do it, it was the right decision. If I didn't make the decision to do it, it was still the right decision for me at the time. But to be fair, we kind of looked at it and said, look, I don't think something like this is going to come across our paths again, and let's give it a go. And we did. And, you know, the big thing was, you know, we made the decision, obviously with my 3 kids as well. And the transition has been absolutely amazing. They have so much, you know, really integrated into their new home, into their new schools with new friends, and the people around have been fantastic. So we're very grateful, and we really love where we are now and love what we do.
Yeah, it's great to start from the point of people. You know, it really does start there above all else, I think, when
100%,
doing
100%.
Yeah.
In anything you do in life, to be honest with you, as long as you surround yourself with good people, you're in a great space. And these people like Patrick, Kelly, Michael, our CEO, Mike Duggan, and all of the team, they all are fantastic people, and they all have a great passion and belief for this, for Keeper's Heart. And, you know, that's what it's about. And we're having fun along the way as well, which is also very important.
Absolutely. And you're making a great whiskey. So let's talk a little bit about the whiskeys. You're in a unique position in that you're following this long, you know, centuries-long tradition of Irish migration to America. But, you know, when I first read about this in the press release, and then, of course, keeping up with the brand, given, you know, that you're making the whiskey, there's a sense that this is an Irish-American whiskey more so than a you know, other traditional American whiskeys you might see, whether it be American single malt or a rye or a bourbon, what have you. What makes Keeper's Heart Irish American, and what sets it apart from what we're seeing in the American industry now?
So there's actually 2 aspects to that question. First of all, our first release, which is Keeper's Heart Irish American, that actually is a blend of Irish grain whiskey, Irish pot still whiskey, and American rye whiskey. So in that whiskey itself, they're all 4-year-old whiskeys. In that whiskey itself, what we've done is we've taken, you know, the smoothness and the richness of Irish whiskey and blended it with the boldness of an American rye. So that's really getting the best of both worlds together. Yeah. So that's our first release, and that's our hero brand. That's sourced whiskey. So we source our Irish whiskey from Great Northern Distillery, both our triple distilled grain whiskey and our triple distilled pot still whiskey. We source it from Great Northern Distillery. And then our rye whiskey we source from MGP in Indiana. So that's a continuous SKU that we will, and a continuous release, and it's our hero brand that will always remain a sourced whiskey.
Okay.
Then we come to the distillery, and in the distillery, what we have done is we have built a distillery around triple copper pot distillation, which is essentially the quintessential Irish style of whiskey making. So we're effectively making American whiskey in the Irish traditional style. So we're currently making what you can call an American single pot still. We're using that traditional Irish mash bill of malted barley and unmalted barley, and we're distilling it 3 times in copper pot stills. The Americanizing of that is actually we're laying it down in virgin American oak barrels. So in order to achieve that taste profile, what we're doing is we're actually creating a heavier style of pot distillate in order for it to be able to compete with the big contribution that you're going to get from the virgin American oak barrel. So we really feel we're going to produce a totally new style of distillate in terms of an American whiskey to the market. And then we have plans throughout this year to actually use those copper pot stills to produce, a triple pot distilled rye, triple pot distilled bourbons. And these are all going to create a different taste profile because of the distillation process we're going to bring through. So we're really excited about all of that style of distillation. So our vision at Keeper's Heart and O'Shaughnessy Distilling is to actually Irishize American whiskey and Americanize Irish whiskey. And that's the philosophy we live by. And that's what we're really enjoying doing at the moment.
Yeah, and that's, I think, why this was perfect for today, talking about the Irish-American sort of heritage of whiskey, in that it's not just heritage, it's modern day. You're doing this now. And it's fascinating that, I think, especially if you're coming from, my side of things, you're always looking for what's new. You're always looking for what's next. You're always trying to kind of be ahead of the curve just to stay relevant. And this, to me, is what's next, because, a triple pot still bourbon or rye is fascinating to me, and I can't wait to taste one. Before we get into triple pot or triple distillation and what that means, let's take it back a little bit more to the base of the distillate and fermentation and the ingredients, because you moved to Minnesota. Minnesota is part of the breadbasket of America. I mean, Minnesota red wheat is synonymous with whiskey making. But there's also the terroir. I mean, Minnesota terroir is very different than, Irish terroir, just in the soil in the ground, the rocks in the ground, the water in the ground. What sort of differences are you seeing working in Minnesota as compared to Ireland from the jump, from the base of building these whiskeys?
Well, I think that's an interesting process, which we really encounter in terms of the brewing and in terms of maximizing the extract that we get from our malted barley and unmalted barley process. So it's interesting in that, even simple things, and you can bring it back to basics of even the grist that we're producing here tends to be that little bit finer than we'd have to produce in Ireland in order to get the same extract. But we have to be very careful because we're using a lauter tun. So managing that grist in order to make sure that when you're in the lauter tun, you don't actually cause a blinding of the plates where you're unable to separate your liquid from your grain. That's a process that we had painstaking problems at the start of commissioning. I will not lie to you. There was a lot of hair tearing hairs out of our heads going, what the hell is going on? But, it's a learning process. And as I said to the team, and it's for me, it's for everybody, is that every time you go at a new process, every time you deal with new equipment, you have to learn your process. You have to learn your equipment. You have to become familiar with it, because every process is going to be different. When you move from one distillery to the next distillery, there's always going to be nuances and differences. Not a mind move from one country to another where you're going to get different reactions of the barley in the harvest. And so we're seeing that. I'm very lucky that we have a team from America that, have great experience in brewing and distilling that are working with me. I mean, we have a guy called Chris Silber, who basically came from Stranahan's Old Elk and has recently worked in deep brewing. We have a lady, Kate Dorges, who was a distiller in Old Elk Distillery. So we've got great experience, and we have people that have experience in operating with American grains. So that has made life a lot easier as well, because they have that experience, they bring that experience with them. We also, as you may or may not be aware, is that, you know, we've David Perkins on board with us as a liquid collaborator and advisor. David Perkins, the founder of High West, he was an absolute, you know, genius in terms of innovation around whiskey blending, but also in whiskey production. So having him on board as well has helped to deal with any of the issues that I'm seeing in America that, you know, I wouldn't have normally seen in Ireland. So that's that whole team mentality and that whole work ethic that we have really allows us to produce great quality whiskey. And even in the commissioning, even though we did have issues, we were able to start producing very good quality distillate relatively soon into the process, sooner than I thought we would ever make it, to be honest. So that side of it has been great. I think when you have the experience of, you know, distilling and you have the experience of brewing, bringing that with you and having a team that has the experience as well makes life a lot easier. It's not as if you're starting from scratch. You also have to have patience, because there was some days initially when we were commissioning, we thought everything should just fall in place together right away, and it didn't.
Yeah.
And some people were surprised that didn't happen. But the reality of it is, it's commissioning. You're never going to get everything right the first few runs. There's always going to be problems. And if there aren't problems, Jesus, I'd be a little bit worried about it myself, to be honest, because I've experienced the commissioning process where we didn't have problems. So that's the fun, that's the excitement, that's the learning, that's the education. Like, at the end of the day, I keep on telling everybody at our distillery, and it's the same for me, it's the same for everybody there. Every day is a school day. You learn something new every day. And that's the philosophy that I've lived by all my life. And what we want to do is that anybody that comes to the distillery as well and visits us, that they get the opportunity to learn as much as they want about the process and what sets us apart from others as they go through the distillery as well.
Excellent. Yeah, that's sounds like it's working out very nicely, which is exciting. Let's talk a little bit about the distillation process, because generally speaking, you know, in the United States, pretty much all whiskey is only double distilled. Irish whiskey is, you know, known for being triple distilled, was set it apart in the 1800s from Scotch, etc. Don't have to get too much into the history of that. But what is happening with the distillate during that third distillation that sets your whiskey, Irish American whiskey, apart?
Well, I think with the triple distillation process, I'll just go through what actually happens a little bit briefly, and then we can discuss what's actually happening in terms of the third and final distillation. The first distillation really is taking your fermented wash and actually removing all alcohol and flavor from that fermented wash. You're not really discriminating against the types of flavors you want in your final distillate at that stage. All you want to do is remove all alcohol and flavor. And you produce an intermediate product called low wines. Those low wines go to the second pot still, which is known as the faint still. And here now you begin to capture the distillates that you want going forward to your spirit still, or the distillate profile and congener profile that you want going forward to your spirit still, and leaving behind the material that you recycle back into the faint still with the next batch of low wines coming forward. So what we capture to go forward to the spirit still is known as the strong faints, and the weak faints are what actually gets recycled back into the faint still with the next batch of low wines coming forward. Now that's a very important part of the process, because number one, from an efficiency point of view, it would be very silly to discard the weak faints, because they still have good alcohols. It still has a lot of alcohol in it. But from a quality and consistency point of view, that recycling allows you to produce a consistent distillate each time at the end of the third distillation. So that recycling ensures that you can create a distillate character per distillation, as opposed to creating a distillate character by 10 separate distillations and blending it all together. You should have a consistency by doing that recycling. We then take the strong faints and we bring them to the spirit still. And in the spirit still, we basically do 3 cuts. The first cut is your heads cut. And the heads cut, the way to best describe the heads cut is, if you consider that the previous distillation that went on in your spirit still, it ended up with tails, which is the heavy boilers. It's the oily. It's a lot of oils. It's a lot of heavy, fainty characteristic.
Right.
In that previous distillation, they have all come across at the end, and they have lodged in the pipework, in the line arm, in the swan neck, in the condenser. So they're still sitting there. You don't want them to come across in your first distillate coming across. So when you start to boil up your still for the first time again, you want to push all of that through. You take that across in your heads. You also find that the more volatile, the lighter boiling elements and congeners will come across first. Some of them are nice to have in your final distillate. Too much of it can make it sickly sweet. So you want to discard some of that as well. So you capture both the remnants from the previous distillation and those heads in your heads cut. The center cut then, which is the heart of the distillate, that's the flavor profile you're looking for. The advantage of the third distillation is that it allows you to bring forward that distillate character more to the fore and hone in on that characteristic that you're looking for by doing it a third time. So that heart is what's taken across, and that's put into the barrels for maturation. And then we have the tails cut, which ultimately is, again, your heavy boilers, your heavier, fainty characteristics, which still have good alcohol. And what happens then ultimately is those faints get recycled back into the spirit still, with the next batch of strong faints coming forward the next time. So that recycling is an essential system for efficiency, but mainly for quality and consistency.
Right, and that's again what really sets Irish whiskey apart is that I like that constant recycling. That's a great way to describe it, because you can visualize, it going through the wash, faint, and spirit still, and seeing it, kind of move in your mind. Let's then talk a little bit about what happens when it goes in the barrel, because not to be indelicate, but Ireland has a very temperate climate compared to Minnesota, which is extreme. I mean, you have hot, humid summers, and you're just getting out of your first winter, I'm guessing, which was cold.
Interesting.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. To be honest, it was better than we expected. The cold weather, it's very interesting, because the cold weather in the US and particularly where we are is totally different to cold weather in Ireland. Obviously, the temperatures are nowhere the same, but it's a drier cold. So someday, and the sun is always shining, so it's actually quite confusing. You see this beautiful sun and blue skies, and you come out and it's absolutely freezing. So managed it. We've enjoyed the snow, but at this stage now we're glad the snow is slowly disappearing. I hope we don't see any more snow now for the rest of the year. I'm told that we could get flurries over the next couple of weeks and maybe into April, so I'm hoping that doesn't happen. In terms of the maturation, yeah, you're quite right in that in Ireland there's a very consistent climate. So in terms of maturation, there's a consistency of maturation. In Minneapolis, you've got these extremes. So what we are doing is, in terms of those extremes, particularly in the winter, we're actually going to heat and our warehouses to ensure that we have a consistent temperature to allow maturation to continue. Because it's too long an extreme cold temperature to actually warrant us not doing it. We really do need to do it in order to maintain a level of maturation. Otherwise, things would just literally shut down for a period of time where nothing would happen, and it would be too long a period of time. So we're going to heat our warehouses to have a consistency of maturation throughout the year. We have to manage that a little bit, because when you're heating during winter, you're obviously increasing the losses that you have as well. So we have to be sensible in the way we do that, in terms of, making sure that we're benefiting our maturation, but we're not actually having a very negative and having extreme losses throughout the year as well. So that's something that we're working on at the moment in order to manage that.
So when, because heating and climate controlled warehouses aren't anything new. I mean, Woodford does it, for instance. Are you aiming for a climate that's more similar to Ireland, or are you just aiming for a climate that's similar to the vibe of Minnesota without the extreme?
Well, I think in terms of the summer, we wanted to actually we will leave it. We won't do anything to cool the warehouses in the summer. Okay. So in terms of that, it's going to be different to Ireland. In terms of during the winter, we'll probably look to keep it around, maybe 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, in order to have a temperate element in the warehouse that will allow it to still mature, but also minimize the level of losses as well.
Right. Because just for everyone watching out there, we're talking about, the expansion and contraction of the wood, which allows the distillate to go in and out of the wood as the barrel shape changes. And you are, taking basically what's triple distilled Irish distillate and you're putting into virgin oak. So far, this isn't your first day in. So far, how are you seeing that triple distillate interact with new oak? And are there any things that's surprising so far that's coming out of a new barrel, as opposed to having always worked with used barrels in the past in Ireland?
Well, in terms of the interaction, what we're seeing is that we're seeing a lot of wood contribution very, very quickly on in the process, which you wouldn't necessarily see in Ireland, but that's to be expected because it is virgin American oak. I'm actually very happy with the way the maturation is progressing, even after a short period of time. I mean, we laid down our first barrels in probably late August, early September.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're 5 months in some of the barrels, and just to see the progression of that in that 5 months is very, very heartening. It's great to see it. It's great to see the interaction. What will be interesting to see is that, I mean, our expectation is that we probably won't put these on market until about year 3. And if the quality isn't right at year 3, we will hold them. We will not actually release them if we don't think the quality is right. It's going to be interesting to see how much the impact of wood is after 3 years, as we monitor that up to 3 years to see, how far the wood contribution goes. Are we losing the overall balance within the barrel, between the barrel contribution and the distillate? So far, because of the style of the distillate and the level of earthiness that we have in our distillate, I'm confident that we will actually be able to balance that in a very good way that will create this new taste profile that should excite people, and hopefully people will enjoy.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, there's of course Keeper's Heart, which you've already mentioned is a blend of source whiskeys from both Ireland and Indiana. Can you kind of walk us through how you built that flavor profile and why you chose, like, for instance, the rye as opposed to a bourbon? In the sense, for me, rye is, another one of the categories that's blowing up right now. I mean, you're seeing ryes being made everywhere. European ryes are starting to get prominence again from Germany and Denmark. Of course, Ireland, Method just put out a rye last year. But walk us through the building of that flavor profile in your Keeper's Heart expression.
Well, that was a great exercise in terms of, it was a big learning experience for me as well. I mean, we started off with 120 to 140 different prototypes for this whiskey.
Right.
And that was because we had different types of Irish whiskey. We had pot still, we had malt whiskey, we had triple and double distilled malt, we had peated malt. We had lots of different Irish whiskeys to deal with. We also had the opportunity to look at different American whiskeys like bourbon, like Tennessee, like rye whiskeys, and different iterations and different proportions of each created these number of prototypes. When we set ourselves out to put the whiskey together, we kind of gave ourselves 3 objectives. Number 1 was to create a great tasting liquid, a great quality whiskey. Well, that's a no-brainer for anybody that wants to put a whiskey out in the market. It has to be good tasting. Number 2 was that each of the components that we put into the whiskey played a part in delivering to the overall taste, complexity, and balance of the whiskey. We didn't want to have any whiskey that was in there just for a filler. We wanted to make sure that they all actually played a part in delivering the taste profile. And then finally was versatility. Because yourself, if you look at the way people enjoyed whiskey 10, 15 years ago, the landscape has changed dramatically. People nowadays want to experiment more with whiskey. Gone is the day where whiskey is just drunk neat or drunk on the rocks. People want to drink it in highballs. People also want to have it in cocktails as well and experiment with it a lot more. So in order for us to play in all of those avenues and all of those spaces, we needed to ensure that our whiskey was versatile. My intention at the start would have been that the whiskey would have ended up being either a pot still and a bourbon or a pot still and a rye whiskey. So 2 components. I could never get the whiskeys to balance. They were always competing against each other because you've got two nice flavored whiskies that contain a lot of flavor, and they were competing against each other all of the time. The introduction of a small amount of grain whiskey allowed them to actually coexist and to increase the overall balance and bring complexity to the overall whiskey. So that was a big learning experience for me as well, in terms of making sure that you had that balance, and the introduction of the grain whiskey was the only way that would work. So that was great, and it really did enhance the overall taste profile of the whiskey. We went with rye, and the reason we went with rye as the American whiskey was simply because we didn't find a bourbon whiskey that actually fitted the bill for us in order to get this balance of complexity either. I really loved the 4-year-old MGP rye. I really thought it brought some fantastic, vibrant flavors to it. It was a lively whiskey. It has some lovely tropical fruits. It has some fantastic spices of cinnamon, clove, cardamom. It really had lovely flavors. And then you had this strong backbone of charred oak. And that really did work well with the herbal earthiness of the pot still and the orchard fruits that comes from the pot still. And then the beautiful butterscotch, vanilla sweetness and smoothness, delicate smoothness from the grain whiskey. So we're really happy with the whiskey we came up with. One of the things that we learned a lot about as we went through this whole iteration of getting to the final blend was that as we got people to taste the whiskey, we actually got them to taste the components as well. And by tasting the components as they went through this process of elimination, it actually gave them a lot more of an informed decision-making when they were choosing the whiskies they preferred, because they knew what each of the components were delivering to the whiskey. So we found that so beneficial that we actually do it at our distillery now. When people come and visit the distillery, they actually do a component tasting before they actually taste Keeper's Heart as part of the tour. And people just find it really, really interesting. And it's very interesting for us as well to see the diversity of opinions of which of the components they prefer, in terms of some people will love the rye, some people will love the pots, others will love the grain whiskey. But what's great and reassuring for us is that they all prefer Keeper's Heart at the end of the day.
Right.
Thankfully, that's the result we're hearing. It would be an awful shame if they preferred one of the components and they thought the Keeper's Heart wasn't great.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. Sort of to wrap us up, because you're in an interesting position in that you spent decades watching Americans come to Ireland to experience their heritage, to experience Irish whiskey, to experience Guinness, all that. Now you're on the flip side of it, in that you're the Irish American in America, and St. Patrick's Day is coming up tomorrow, which will, especially in the Midwest, will be an explosion of culture and bacchanalia, drinking and all that. What are you seeing, like, being on the other side now that you're in Minnesota? How do you feel like Irish American culture is sort of impacting, just in that you have this distillery now where people can come and enjoy whiskey in America, Irish American whiskey in America, as opposed to crossing the pond to experience Irish whiskey in Ireland? And what's the sort of feeling you get from that?
Yeah, well, it's very, very apparent that people in America that have Irish roots are really, really proud of their Irish roots. And it's great to see that. And it's great to be the Irish person that's able to, talk to people about their Irish roots, because they're so passionate about, their family, that their generations that came before them from Ireland. And, it's really, really meaningful for them. And it's really, really meaningful to them. And that is great, because with O'Shaughnessy Distilling at our distillery where Keeper's Heart is made, we love welcoming people to come and have a drink. And one of our visions is really to create moments for people to have fun together, right? Yeah. And if you think about the last couple of years where everybody has been apart, it's never been so important for us to get together again and to really spend time with each other. And we have a space now, like our distillery is 30,000 square feet, 15,000 of distilling operations and 15,000 of hospitality, where we have a whiskey lounge, we've cocktail bar, we've outdoor terraces, where lots of people can come together and have fun and share moments together. Like St. Patrick's Day, think about it. For the last 2 years, people haven't been able to celebrate that. Right. And Americans really want to celebrate their Irish heritage. And that is, I'm blown away by, people when you meet them, and they're able to go back through their lineage and tell you exactly where their great 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 grandfather came from, or their grandmother came from, and they're so proud, and they've been back and they've visited their graves, and they've connected with relations. I'm so proud to be Irish when people tell me that. I mean, it's just, it is a great feeling, and I love the transition we have made here. I love hearing all of these stories. I'm really looking forward to the celebrations for St. Patrick's Day here. It's also, this marks the 2nd anniversary of us breaking ground for the distillery, which is very special for us as well. So we plan to have a massive party at the distillery. We're marching in the parade tomorrow. We're visiting on-premise accounts that are supporting Keeper's Heart, and then it's culminating with a big party at the distillery, where we're asking anybody or everybody with Irish heritage, or who can say singing an Irish song or with an Irish accent, come visit us and enjoy Keeper's Heart, because that's what it's about. It's about people coming together and sharing great moments together.
Absolutely, yeah. It's I think it was 1999 or 2000 when I first went to Ireland for St. Patrick's Day, and I've been back since, and it's always been a sort of cultural touchstone, because it's such an amazing time to be in Ireland. But also growing up in the U.S., I mean, St. Patrick's Day has been, it's been one of those holidays that everyone seemed to celebrate coast to coast. So it's always been nice.
Yeah, like for me, the sad thing about it for me is that I'm not sharing it with my parents or my wife's parents and family like that. But, I know that they'll be celebrating it in Ireland, and they're coming and visiting us in April and May of this year. So that's going to be great, because that's the hard part about moving to the US. With, I moved my wife and my 3 kids, and we're very happy here. But we miss our family back in Ireland. We were fortunate enough, we get the opportunity to go back at Christmas and during the year and in the summer. But, when days like this of St. Patrick's Day, where we'd normally be as a family celebrating it, it's a little bit difficult on those days. But I'm sure we'll have a fun day tomorrow as well.
Absolutely. So, for anyone watching out there, Keeper's Heart is hitting the shelves now, just in time for St. Patrick's Day. And, I think it's a fascinating new way in American whiskey, where you can find something new, something different. And I'm very much looking forward to, the barrels you're laying down now, to see what comes up next in the next few years. Brian, do you want to cap anything off with a message for anyone who's looking for St. Patrick's Day good time?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say is that have great fun tomorrow and make the most of the day. It's been a while since we've been able to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, in public, instead of being stuck indoors. So no, it's a day for great celebration, and I just hope everybody enjoys it. And anybody that wants to come and visit us at our distillery at Keeper's Heart, please come visit us, because we'd only be too happy to see you and have great fun together. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to getting to Minneapolis again. I have a couple restaurants I need to go there, and so now I need to come see you too. And
we'd love to have you. We'd love to have you.
Yeah, all the more reason to get up there. And for everyone watching, I want to thank you very much for tuning in. And if you're watching this after the fact, just because it's not St. Patrick's Day when you're watching this, you can still go to O'SHAUGHNESSY Distillery in Minneapolis anytime. You can also come back to Beverage. We're going to have more panels, every Wednesday, same time, same place. We got a great panel coming up next week, March 30th. And you can also find our tasting kit on reservebar.com, where you can sample American single malts. And yes, follow Brian Nation, follow what they're doing, because it's an interesting just bridge between Irish and American whiskey and culture that's new in the whiskey industry, and you should all find it. You'll find me talking about it on UPROXX.com for sure. I'm very much looking forward to reviewing the whiskey for them. And for everyone else, have a great St. Patrick's Day tomorrow. And Brian, thank you. Have a great night.
Thanks a million, Zach. Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye-bye.